The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I stepped into Grandma Elizabeth's house for the first time in 3 years. The familiar scent of lavender and old wood hit me like a wave of nostalgia, but something felt different this time. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I dropped my suitcase by the door and called out, "Grandma, I'm here," but my voice echoed back hollow and unanswered. The afternoon light filtered through dusty windows, casting long fingers of gold across the hardwood floors I used to slide across in my socks as a child. Now, at 25, those carefree days felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. Elizabeth emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a faded apron, her silver hair pulled back in the same tight bun she'd worn for as long as I could remember. Her smile was warm, but I caught something flickering behind her pale blue eyes, something that looked almost like fear. "Jennifer, sweetheart," she said, pulling me into a hug that felt more desperate than welcoming. "I'm so glad you're here. The house has been too quiet without family around." She held me at arm's length, studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. There was something she wasn't telling me, something that made her fingers tremble slightly as she brushed a strand of hair from my face. The weight of unspoken words hung between us like a thick curtain. As we sat in the living room catching up over tea, my eyes kept drifting to the ceiling, to the small door that led to the attic. It had always been locked, always been off limits, and Grandma's warnings about staying away from it had been as constant as the Chicago wind. "There's nothing up there but old junk and dust," she'd always said, but her voice would take on a sharp edge that brooked no argument. Now something about that door seemed different, though I couldn't put my finger on what. The brass handle caught the light differently, and I could swear I saw a thin line of shadow beneath it that hadn't been there before. When I mentioned how quiet the neighborhood had become, Elizabeth's cup rattled against her saucer, and she quickly changed the subject to my job in New York. That evening, as I unpacked in my old bedroom, I heard it, a soft thudding sound from above, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I froze, listening intently, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. When I asked Elizabeth about it over dinner, she dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "Old houses make all sorts of noises, dear. The wood settles, pipes creak, you know how it is." But her laugh sounded forced, and she avoided meeting my eyes. The way she gripped her fork a little too tightly, the way her gaze kept darting upward, it all felt wrong. I'd grown up in this house, and I knew every sound it made. This was something new, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams of locked doors and whispered secrets. I found myself standing at the foot of the attic stairs more than once, my hand reaching for the handle before I caught myself and retreated to my room. The house seemed to pulse around me, alive with mysteries I'd never noticed as a child. Every creak of the floorboards above my head made me wonder what Elizabeth was hiding up there, and why she'd become so adamant about keeping me away from it. The moonlight streaming through my bedroom window cast strange shadows on the walls, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was watching me, waiting for something. When morning finally came, I was more exhausted than when I'd gone to bed. The next day brought an unexpected visitor, Michael Chen, my childhood friend who lived 2 houses down. He'd grown tall and lean, his dark hair now styled professionally, but his warm smile was exactly the same as I remembered. "Jenny, I heard you were back in town," he said, pulling me into a friendly hug on the front porch. "How long has it been? 5 years?" We fell into easy conversation, reminiscing about our adventures in the neighborhood, but when I mentioned the strange sounds from the attic, his expression grew serious. "You know, I've seen lights up there sometimes," he said quietly, glancing toward the house. "Late at night, when your grandmother thinks no one's watching. I always wondered what she was doing up there." His words sent a chill down my spine, confirming what I'd already begun to suspect. Elizabeth appeared in the doorway just then, her face pale and drawn. "Michael, how lovely to see you," she said, but her voice was strained, and I noticed how her hands shook as she smoothed down her apron. "Jennifer, dear, could you help me with something in the kitchen?" The way she said it wasn't really a request, and I could feel the tension radiating from her small frame. Michael seemed to sense it too, making his excuses and promising to catch up with me later. As we watched him walk away, Elizabeth's grip on my arm was almost painful. "You shouldn't be discussing family matters with the neighbors," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some things are better left alone." The warning in her tone was unmistakable, but it only made me more determined to uncover whatever she was hiding. That afternoon, while Elizabeth napped in her chair, I found myself standing at the bottom of the attic stairs again. The pull was irresistible now, like a magnet drawing me upward. My heart pounded as I climbed each step, the old wood groaning under my weight. When I reached the top, I gasped. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. I'd never seen it anything but tightly locked, and the sight of that narrow opening filled me with both excitement and dread. My grandmother's warnings echoed in my mind, but curiosity won out over caution. I pressed my palm against the door, feeling it swing open with surprising ease. The hinges didn't even creak, as if they'd been recently oiled. Whatever lay beyond that threshold, I knew there was no turning back now. The attic was nothing like I'd imagined. Instead of the dusty, cobweb-filled storage space I'd expected, I found myself in a carefully organized room with polished wooden floors and soft lighting from several strategically placed lamps. The air smelled of cedar and something else, a faint perfume that seemed familiar, yet foreign. Boxes lined the walls in neat rows, each one labeled with dates spanning decades, some going back to before I was born. My hands trembled as I reached for the nearest box, marked 1987 to 1990 in Elizabeth's careful handwriting. The cardboard was pristine, as if it had been recently handled, and when I lifted the lid, I found myself staring at photographs of people I'd never seen before. A young woman with dark hair and laughing eyes stood beside a man in a military uniform, their arms wrapped around two small children who couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. My breath caught in my throat as I studied the woman's face more closely. The bone structure, the shape of her eyes, the way she tilted her head slightly to the left when she smiled. It was unmistakably my grandmother, but younger than I'd ever seen her. Yet something was wrong with this picture. Elizabeth had always told me she'd only had one child, my father, and that he'd died when I was a baby. She'd raised me alone, she said, after my mother abandoned us both. But here was evidence of another family, another life that she'd never mentioned. The children in the photographs looked nothing like my father in the few pictures I'd seen of him. They had different features, different coloring, and the way they clung to this younger version of Elizabeth suggested a deep, loving bond that contradicted everything I thought I knew about my family history. I set the photographs aside with shaking hands and dug deeper into the box. What I found next made my knees weak. A marriage certificate dated 1985 bearing the name Elena Vasquez, where I expected to see Elizabeth Morrison. The groom's name was listed as Carlos Vasquez, and the location was Miami, Florida. My grandmother had never mentioned living in Florida, never spoken Spanish in my presence, never given any indication that she'd been married to anyone other than my grandfather, who had supposedly died before I was born. The certificate looked official, complete with raised seals and official signatures, and the photograph attached showed the same woman from the family photos, radiant in a simple white dress. I turned the document over and over in my hands, as if staring at it long enough might make it disappear or transform into something that made sense within the context of my life. The sound of footsteps on the stairs below sent panic shooting through my veins. I quickly stuffed the photographs and certificate back into the box, my heart hammering against my ribs as I tried to make everything look undisturbed. Elizabeth's voice drifted up from the bottom of the stairs, calling my name with a note of concern that made my stomach clench. "Jennifer, where are you, dear?" I could hear her climbing the steps, each footfall bringing her closer to discovering my transgression. The attic suddenly felt like a trap, the walls closing in around me as I realized there was nowhere to hide and no way to explain what I was doing up here. My mind raced, searching for an excuse, any plausible reason for why I'd disobeyed her most fundamental rule. The weight of what I'd discovered pressed down on me like a physical force, making it hard to breathe. "I'm up here, Grandma," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady as I moved away from the boxes and toward the door. When she appeared in the doorway, her face went through a series of emotions. surprise, fear, anger, and finally, a kind of resigned sadness that made her look older than her 78 years. "I told you never to come up here," she said quietly. But there was no real anger in her voice, only a bone-deep weariness that suggested she'd been dreading this moment for a long time. She stepped into the attic, her eyes scanning the room as if checking to see what I might have disturbed. "Some doors are meant to stay closed, Jennifer. Some secrets are buried for good reason." The way she said it made me realize that she'd always known this day would come, that my curiosity would eventually overcome my obedience. I wanted to confront her immediately, to demand explanations for the photographs and the marriage certificate, but something in her expression stopped me. She looked fragile suddenly, like a woman carrying the weight of decades of carefully constructed lies. "I was just curious," I said lamely, hating how young and foolish I sounded. "I heard noises, and the door was open, and I thought maybe—" Elizabeth held up a hand to stop me, her pale blue eyes filled with a pain I'd never seen before. "I know, sweetheart. I know." She moved to one of the boxes and placed her hand on top of it, almost protectively. "I've been coming up here more often lately, trying to decide what to do with all of this. I suppose I got careless with the lock." Her admission hung between us like a confession, and I realized that whatever secrets this room held, she was tired of carrying them alone. We stood in silence for several long moments, the weight of unspoken truths filling the space between us. Finally, Elizabeth sighed and gestured toward the boxes. "I suppose you've seen enough to have questions," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I always hoped I could take these secrets to my grave, that you'd never have to know about the choices I made before you came into my life." The sadness in her voice was so profound that I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Whatever she was hiding, whatever lies she'd built our relationship on, I could see that keeping them had cost her dearly. "But maybe it's time," she continued, more to herself than to me. "Maybe it's time you knew who I really am, and who I used to be before I became your grandmother." The words sent a chill through me, because they suggested that even the most fundamental aspects of my identity might be built on falsehoods. As we made our way back downstairs, I couldn't stop thinking about the photographs and the marriage certificate. Elena Vasquez. The name felt foreign on my tongue when I tried to say it silently. Who was this woman who looked like my grandmother but lived a completely different life? What had happened to Carlos and those two children who'd smiled so happily in the family photos? And most importantly, what did any of this have to do with me and the story I'd been told about my origins? Elizabeth moved slowly ahead of me, her shoulders bowed as if she were carrying an invisible burden. When we reached the living room, she settled into her favorite chair and looked at me with eyes that seemed to hold decades of regret. "Sit down, Jennifer," she said softly. "There are things I need to tell you, things I should have told you years ago. But I want you to understand that everything I did, every lie I told, was to protect you from a truth I thought would destroy you." Elizabeth's hands shook as she poured herself a glass of water, the ice cubes clinking against the sides like tiny bells announcing the end of an era. I sat across from her, my mind reeling with questions I wasn't sure I was ready to have answered. The afternoon light streaming through the windows seemed different now, harsher somehow, as if it were illuminating truths that had been hidden in shadow for too long. "My real name is Elena Vasquez," she began, her voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear her. "I was born in Cuba, came to Miami when I was 16, with nothing but the clothes on my back and a determination to build a new life in America." The words felt surreal coming from the woman I'd known as Elizabeth Morrison my entire life. This person sitting across from me was suddenly a stranger, someone whose entire identity had been carefully constructed to hide a past I couldn't even begin to imagine. She told me about Carlos, her first husband, a kind man who worked construction and dreamed of opening his own business. They'd been happy, she said, building a life together in Miami's vibrant Cuban community. "We had 2 children," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "Maria and Diego. They were beautiful, Jennifer, so full of life and laughter. Maria had your father's eyes, and Diego had my stubborn streak." The way she spoke about them, with such tenderness and pain, made it clear that these weren't distant memories, but wounds that had never properly healed. I found myself leaning forward, desperate to understand how this woman with her secret family connected to the grandmother who had raised me with such devotion. The pieces of my life were shifting, rearranging themselves into patterns I didn't recognize. "What happened to them?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. Elizabeth's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked every one of her 78 years. "There was an accident," she whispered. "A drunk driver ran a red light. Carlos was driving the kids home from school." She paused, struggling to compose herself, and I could see the effort it took for her to continue. "I lost them all in one terrible moment. My husband, my babies, my entire world, gone." The raw pain in her voice was so intense that I felt tears streaming down my own cheeks. I tried to imagine the magnitude of such a loss, the kind of grief that could reshape a person's entire existence. I couldn't stay in Miami after that. Everything reminded me of them. So I ran, Jennifer. I ran as far and as fast as I could. The story she told next was like something out of a movie. A grief-stricken woman fleeing her old life, taking on a new identity, moving from city to city until she finally settled in Chicago. "I became Elizabeth Morrison," she said, "a widow with no children, no past, no connections to the life that had been destroyed. I thought if I could just disappear completely, maybe the pain would disappear too. But it hadn't, of course. The grief had followed her north, settling into her bones like a chronic ache that never fully went away. She'd worked as a seamstress, kept to herself, built walls around her heart that she thought would protect her from ever experiencing such devastating loss again. And then your father came into my life," she said, her voice softening slightly. "Not my biological son, but a young man who needed a mother as much as I needed someone to love. My father, the man I'd been told was Elizabeth's only child, had actually been a troubled teenager she'd taken in through a church program. David was 17 when he came to live with me," she explained. "His parents had died in a house fire, and he'd been bouncing between foster homes for years. He was angry, hurt, convinced that everyone he loved would eventually leave him. The parallels between their stories weren't lost on me. Two people devastated by loss, finding solace in each other's company. I legally adopted him when he turned 18, Elizabeth continued. He took my name, and I became the only mother he'd ever really known. For a while, we healed each other." The love in her voice when she spoke about my father was genuine, and I realized that while the details of her story had been fabricated, her feelings for him had been completely real. But then came the part of the story I thought I knew. My father's relationship with my mother, their brief marriage, his death in a car accident when I was just 6 months old. "Your mother was complicated," Elizabeth said carefully. "Beautiful, charming, but not ready for the responsibilities of marriage and motherhood. When David died, she fell apart completely, started drinking, staying out all night, leaving you with me for days at a time." The picture she painted was heartbreaking. A young woman drowning in grief and guilt, unable to cope with the reality of raising a child alone. "One day she just didn't come back," Elizabeth said simply. "Left a note saying she couldn't handle it anymore, that you'd be better off without her. I never heard from her again." The abandonment I'd grown up believing was my mother's choice suddenly seemed more like the desperate act of someone who was completely broken. "So I raised you," Elizabeth continued, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "And for the first time since I lost my first family, I felt whole again. You gave me a reason to get up in the morning, a purpose beyond just surviving each day. I know I should have told you the truth about who I really was, but I was terrified that if you knew about Elena Vasquez and her tragic past, you might see me differently. You might realize that everyone I'd ever loved had been taken from me, and you might worry that the same fate awaited you." The fear in her voice was palpable, and I began to understand the weight of the secret she'd been carrying. She hadn't just been protecting herself from painful memories. She'd been protecting me from the knowledge that love and loss were so intimately connected in her experience. As the sun began to set outside, casting long shadows across the living room, I struggled to process everything I'd learned. The woman I'd known as my grandmother was actually a Cuban immigrant named Elena, who'd lost her entire family and reinvented herself to escape the pain. My father hadn't been her biological son, but an adopted child who'd given her a second chance at motherhood. And I was the granddaughter of a woman whose real grandchildren had died decades before I was born. "I understand if you're angry," Elizabeth said quietly. I understand if you feel like your entire life has been built on lies. But I need you to know that my love for you has always been real, Jennifer. You saved me in ways you'll never understand. And raising you has been the greatest privilege of my life. Her words hung in the air between us, and I realized that despite the shocking revelations, the love I felt for her hadn't diminished. If anything, understanding the depth of her sacrifice made me love her more. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I was living in someone else's life. Everything in my childhood bedroom looked the same, but nothing felt real anymore after learning that my grandmother was actually Elena Vasquez, a Cuban woman who had lost her entire family and reinvented herself to escape unbearable grief. I found her in the kitchen making blueberry pancakes, moving with the same precision but seeming more fragile, as if revealing her secrets had aged her overnight. We need to talk more, I said quietly, settling into my chair. I need to understand everything, Elena. The name felt strange on my tongue, but I could see her shoulders tense when I said it, as if hearing her real name was both relief and wound. What do you want to know? She asked, exhaustion heavy in her voice as she sat across from me with cold coffee. I wanted to know about Maria and Diego, about the life she'd had before becoming my grandmother, about how she'd survived such devastating loss and still found room to love me. But then she told me something that shattered everything. I'm dying, Jennifer. The doctors gave me 6 months, maybe less. The words hit me like a sledgehammer, and suddenly I understood why she was finally revealing these secrets. I wanted you to know the truth before I'm gone, she continued, tears in her eyes. You weren't just my granddaughter. You were my second chance at happiness, my proof that life could still hold beauty even after unimaginable loss. The weeks that followed were a blur of doctor's appointments, difficult conversations, and precious moments stolen between the reality of Elena's diagnosis. I had taken leave from my job in New York to stay with her, and we spent our days going through the boxes in the attic, each one revealing another piece of her hidden life. But it was Michael who brought the most shocking revelation of all when he appeared at our door one evening, his face pale and his hands shaking as he held an old newspaper clipping. Jenny, I need to show you something, he said, his voice barely steady. I've been doing some research since you told me about your grandmother's real name, and I found this article from the Miami Herald, dated 3 months after the accident that killed her family. The newspaper clipping was yellowed with age, but the headline was still clearly visible. Local woman survives family tragedy, disappears from hospital. My blood ran cold as I read the article, which described how Elena Vasquez had been found unconscious at the scene of the accident that killed her husband and children, how she'd spent weeks in a coma, and how she'd vanished from the hospital before doctors could discharge her. But the most shocking detail was buried in the final paragraph. The article mentioned that Elena had been pregnant at the time of the accident and that she'd given birth to a daughter while in the coma. The infant, born prematurely due to trauma, was placed in state care when the mother disappeared, the article read. My hands trembled as the implications hit me like a freight train. I wasn't just Elena's adopted granddaughter. I'm your daughter, I whispered, the words feeling foreign and impossible even as they left my lips. Elena's face crumpled as she nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks as decades of carefully constructed lies finally crumbled around us. I was so young when I had you, barely 19, and when I woke up from the coma and learned that Carlos and the children were dead, I couldn't handle the thought of raising another child I might lose, she sobbed. So I ran, and I let the state believe I had died too. Years later, when I was stronger, when I had become Elizabeth Morrison, I found out where you'd been placed, and I arranged to adopt you through David, making it look like you were his child instead of mine. The magnitude of her deception was staggering. She hadn't just hidden her identity, she had hidden the fact that I was her biological daughter, that the woman I'd called grandmother was actually my mother.